Welcome to the Foreign Tigers podcast with me, Louis.
And with me, Erik.
Welcome to another episode of the Foreign Tigers podcast, Global Focus. Today's episode is the second and final part of our two-part series on the history of capitalism and the coming world order.
In the previous episode, we explored Giovanni Arrighi's work and learned how the history of capitalism has been marked by four eras, each led by a different hegemon: the Genoese, the Dutch, the British, and the American eras. While each hegemon expands the world capitalist system, each time that hegemon collapses, and each time following a path from commercialization to financialization.
As the American-led capitalist order becomes increasingly financialized and increasing instability spreads throughout the system, an inevitable question arises. After the American era, what comes next? To help unpack this question, we are joined once again by Professor Cuz Potter of Korea University.
Woo! 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 Yeah.
Thanks for joining us again. We really appreciate it.
I had a pleasure to be here.
All right, so it's been a few weeks since our last conversation. Could you, we need to refresh our memory, so could you start us off with a recap?
Right, sure. As you mentioned, right, there have been, according to Arrighi, 4 systemic cycles of accumulation. And one thing that we didn't talk about last time was this alternation between extensive and intensive cycles of accumulation. So the notion is that the extensive cycles are cycles where the global economic relations spread, and the intensive cycles are those cycles in which economic activity intensifies and increases within existing territorial relations. So just to sort of make that a little more concrete, what you might recall is we had the Genoese period in which the Genoese capitalists financed Spanish territorial expansion through colonialism, which is an extensive phase, right? The Spanish are going out of Europe and conquering new territories, extending the global economy for the Spanish. Then, as the Dutch take over in the mid-1600s, they essentially take over these colonies and begin to intensify the level of trade, focusing trade less on some of the agricultural goods and gold and silver, and expanded into spices and other raw materials and I think some quasi-manufactured goods, but they intensify the degree of trade that they then, of course, concentrated in Amsterdam. Following that, the British introduced the new system of industrial capitalism, free trade imperialism, which then, again, switches to an extensive phase because the primary difference here is that the British begin to directly manage the territories of their empire. I'm sorry, I'm hesitating because I feel like I've missed out a piece here, but we'll come back to it. We can review it again next time. So, and then the final phase here, or the most recent phase, has been the American one, which has been the American takeover of the British system, or global economy for the most part, and the U.S. system has functioned to intensify global trade there. So if this alteration between extensive and intensive is accurate, then the next phase should also be an extensive phase, right? Capitalism itself should now expand into new territory, which is kind of a oxymoron given that the U.S. global economy is perhaps the first truly global economy.
Right. It's hard to imagine it finding new territory because it seems at this point everything in the global economy is interconnected. So what does Arrighi predict then? how can it go further?
So Arrighi's prediction is, as I mentioned last time, that China is going to be this next phase. And I'm Frankly, I am struggling to recall why he would argue that it was extensive. However, I believe it is about the expansion into new markets and the extension of new markets, particularly into China and East Asia in general, because what he and other world systems theorists were viewing in the 80s, 90s as they were writing these pieces was the rise of China, and the shift, and also the success of Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, Japan to a certain extent. Japan had already been there. And so what they posited is that the global economy was going to shift to East Asia as the central hegemon for setting up the coming order.
Is it more a case of refinement then? Like, so if we are saying, the US-led era is, essentially global, which is hard to argue against, but perhaps it's global refinement in China's era, in quotes. The Belt and Road Initiative, kind of refining those pathways towards the hegemon of the time. Is that somewhat where we might be going?
I suppose we could think about it this way, right? Certainly the Belt and Road Initiative would be a tool for extending capitalism's reach. But that's only one component of what would constitute a new hegemon for Origi, right? Because the hegemon has to sort of set the global standard, global practices that are prevalent within the global economy, and it also has to represent a new political economic organization. Right, which China arguably does, right? It's sort of authoritarian state capitalism, which is a different model from what we see in the U.S. and is arguably something that is growing in its global prevalence, right? Because for the longest time, as we know, the end of history, according to Fukuyama and others, is that with the fall of the wall in '89, we were going to see simply the expansion of capitalist growth and democratic growth going hand in hand together into the foreseeable future, right? That for Fukuyama, the ideological battle had ended with the victory of democratic capitalism. But the rise of China and some other economies in the current era show that authoritarian state capitalism is also a reasonable and functional, highly functional alternative to the democratic capitalist proposal.
Okay, so we talked a bit about the financialization of these eras. That's the ringing bell of a new era kind of looming. Between now and then, the co-founder of Kalshi, you've heard of Kalshi? It's like polymarket type betting.
Okay.
So like, you can bet on the odds of, a pine cone falling from a tree, I think is kind of their premise. But
we can bet on the number of listeners to this podcast.
Absolutely. But so that's kind of an apt analogy, because the co-founder of Kalshi, I'm not sure which one, I could probably find the quote, but I screenshotted part of it. So the long-term vision is to financialize everything and create a tradable asset out of any difference in opinion. That fits and jibes exactly of what you were saying. Like this financialization is the canary in the coal mine for a new era. Is there a way that technology kind of arrests the cycles of accumulation, and we kind of just stall out?
So yes, I think there is, and I think that's part of Origi's model in general, right? That each systemic cycle of accumulation is a combination of political, economic, technology, right? I mean, not just and scientific technology. So each of those systems does have its own limit that is only overcome through the introduction of new sort of socio-political technologies, but also potentially brand new technologies as well.
Because I'm being the provocateur here and going, I don't believe you.
Yeah. Well, I guess when I think about it, I don't see how technology necessarily impedes it. would slow or arrest a cycle of accumulation from ending, but rather, I mean, I'd imagine it'd be the driver, because it's the thing that would change, relative power between states, or who has like more relevance in a system. So, like if anything, I'd expect it to be the main, like one of the main change agents, and like I feel like we're seeing that in China already. Maybe not with the current technological race.
Well, we are on the cusp of several technological advances, right? Like AI, whoever can perfect, AGI is going to be a big winner. Whoever can perfect quantum is going to be a big winner. And China's rapidly, accumulating various equipment, largest navy on earth, etc. So we are standing on the cusp of technological scales, seesaw, so to speak. So, yeah, maybe we are just predestined towards this cycle change. So what does the Chinese hegemonic systemic cycle look like? Is it, just an evolution? Is it because, like you mentioned, their system is quite different to ours. So does Arrighi go into any kind of forecasting about what that might look like?
He does not go into it in what I have read. The follow-up book to, or one of the follow-up books, was Adam Smith in Beijing.
So it was a read the next book.
Read the next book. That's the next podcast, maybe. But a couple of thoughts there. One, first is technology itself could be both an inhibitor and a trigger of new development, right? Because when we build out a system that is based on one technology, then that technology becomes its own set of limits, right? So you can think of, for instance, even just landlines for phones in the North, right? That is a technology that facilitated a great deal of advance in the West and the North, and throughout much of the world, but also held back the introduction of mobile phones and things like this, which came more quickly here in Asia, and in places that didn't ever have landlines. So this is a sort of uneven geographical development argument in which technology itself, because there's so much investment in it, because so much, because capitalists are interested in squeezing as much profit out of it as possible, they aren't going to innovate as quickly. And plus, you have systems that are dependent on these technologies.
Yeah.
Whereas in a new place with a new technology, you can introduce it more quickly. So technology could be, it could inhibit advance in one place, but facilitate it in another.
I guess a good case in point of that is, petrol and gas to Americans, for cars and, electric vehicles, right? Just encouraging innovation in electric vehicles, but also at the same time we're being held back by, I'm not going to name names through fear of petrol company wrath, but
a strong commitment to
exactly.
Fossil fuel consumption.
So they're obviously invested in continuing to sell their product, regardless of the harm it may or may not be doing, in their opinion, to the planet. So yeah, that makes total sense. I guess we can see it in just that one sector.
Right.
I want to jump back a little bit because I was thinking about your comment from earlier. My brain, it works really slow. It gathers speed. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill or a mountain. Because I was just thinking, so we're talking about this competition, this technological competition, and how it will ultimately change, who's the next hegemon. And I realized, though, the way that competition plays out in the U.S. and in China looks really different. I think if China, whoever wins the race, it's going to look so, regardless of who wins the race, the outcome is different just because the way that technology is integrated into the state and politics in each country. Like in China, it's going to be much more aligned with state interests and empowering the state to carry out its, political and foreign policy agenda. But in the U.S., that's not really where technology feels to be at the moment.
Really?
Well, I definitely obviously there's a connection, but I think it's like it's in private hands. It seems like it's
at least
much
not
more
traditionally.
Right,
We
right.
saw some of the biggest tech giants sat behind the president-elect becoming president.
Oh, that's, yeah,
right?
true. But I guess what I'm talking about is that I feel like it exists in its own bubble in a way. Like, obviously it's connected to power in the United States, but also it is its own separate power center, is the claim I'm making.
It chooses when to align and then not align.
Right.
Whereas in China, it's dictated alignment.
So I just wonder, so I'm just saying, depending on how the race goes, whoever wins, where that power then accumulates will be in depending on who wins, it would be in very different places, like a state or more private hands.
Does that ring true?
Yes.
Tell us.
Tell us.
Tell us, as if I knew.
Yeah.
And of course, just like Origi, I don't know. What did I want to say? I mean, I do think the U.S. now is what we've seen in the U.S. is now the ascension of, I don't know, I'll just call it crypto capital because it sounds cool. But, Silicon Valley capital as sort of taking the throne in the U.S. Political economic system and displacing some of the older, more traditional capitalist interests around manufacturing and what have you. So I think that's probably a more permanent situation. But more for me anyway, I don't think it's going to be China that is the next hegemon, right? I think that it's going to be these tech companies that are going to more or less compete at a global level and dominate the next phase, the next cycle of accumulation. And there will be certainly competition between Chinese firms and U.S. firms primarily in doing this. But
you foresee these multinational tech companies kind of duking it out as if they were semi-states?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, what I see coming forward, my prediction is that it's not China as the hegemon. It's what I would call fully automated capitalism, right? Which is this idea that the whole capitalist system is going to be more or less algorithmically managed in a sense. There's a great book, Zukhov's Surveillance Capitalism that I love, in which she argues that the evolution of technology of internet technology and what have you in Silicon Valley had an inflection point somewhere around, I think it was 2014, 2016 at Google, when they realized that they could understand what was happening in the U.S. population, or at least the user base, by correlating a spike in a TV show with a spike in keyword usage or searches, right? And that was when Google realized that the search results and user data, the user exhaust, all that extra information that they can collect from people clicking on different things at different times, could be used for advertising, right? And that's when the new model for her begins to kick off. And what she is suggesting is that at the time of writing, which was a few years ago now, I forget the exact date, but is that we're actually entering into a new phase, which will only be accelerated by the use of AI, in which she suggests that there's, I think it's behavioral surplus is her notion, is that at this point, the big tech firms, Meta, Google, Tencent, whatever, have so much information about their user base that they can not only predict what people are likely to buy, right? So, I mean, Walmart, Amazon now has enough knowledge about aggregate consumer spending and consumption to be able to, with foresight, say, okay, we need to stock more of this. We need to get this supply chain moving. We're going to have to, Super Bowl is coming up. Oh, it is coming up, maybe.
February.
So, okay, right around the corner. So we're going to have to make sure that, the supply chain for chicken wings gets increased, right? I mean, these things that any major retailer has been trying to do, they can do on steroids, right? Because they know every individual's shopping history to a certain degree. So there's this ability to statistically predict what is going to happen. But she argues that now we're entering a new inflection point too, in which these companies have developed the ability to actually steer us into particular consumption habits. So they know, they've done enough studies to be able to say about in general, but also about us as individuals, to say when this person starts to spend too much time looking at cat memes, they're going to buy kitty litter.
Right.
And so that is when they serve you the ad for kitty litter to prompt you to buy a particular brand at a particular time from a particular place.
Well, it sounds like more chicken wings and cat memes for me. What could go wrong?
Nothing. Nothing could go wrong.
You will buy what they tell you and you will like it.
Exactly.
I eagerly await this future.
I guess that, all of that rings true, right? Like, for people that, habitually online, just the more information and the more you use it, the more, ads and the more like kind of aligned the worldview you're seeing online perpetuates itself, really. Like, for instance, I see dog adverts, dental teeth like sticks for my dog, and that's because I follow a significant number of like cute doggy pages, like because I like seeing, content about dogs. I have my dog and all that kind of stuff. So are we saying now that, not only is, because that's quite an easy predictor, right? This person follows dog pages, therefore they either have a dog or they have an interest in dogs, and they might get a dog in the future. So we're saying we can go beyond that now, and we'll predict that perhaps that person in the future might want to make donations to dog-aligned causes, or they might act in the interests of. In the UK, there was a recent bill about bestowing more rights on domestic pets. They might be a supporter of this particular legislation, because I think that's where this amount of data starts to scare me personally. Like, it's not, hey, buy this particular brand of dog food is not, all right, fine, it's not so bad. But this person might be tempted to join activist causes. This person might be tempted to oppose legislation about XYZ thing using data from our habits. That's where this particular technological phase starts to scare me. So are we just saying that we're going towards, because we've already said it expands, it grows, it builds upon systems before it. Are we entering just like you said, the book, mass surveillance? Everything is knowable, everything is searchable, everything is, in some ways, in quotes, predictable.
Well, big questions here on the Foreign Tigers podcast. Right. So that is, just to make one clarification here. This shift into the use of behavioral surplus is, I think, one of the central component of the extensive component of the new phase, right? That it's not actually geography as we typically think of it, that it gets expanded. It's not that fully automated capitalism extends the territory around which capitalism is practiced. I mean, unless we try to start including Mars and the moon and that kind of stuff, but that is easy to accept in a case like this. Really, I think that extension is actually inward into our private worlds, right? So which is still a spatial thing, but it's interior for us. And so that's the extensive piece. And I do think that the ability to predict is getting stronger. And of course, with any prediction, one always has to remember that these are statistical predictions, which don't necessarily say that, Louis is going to buy kitty litter from Erik tomorrow at 3 p.m. It's somebody like you in this particular market is likely to buy, that a number of people in this market are likely to buy kitty litter tomorrow afternoon in this area. So it doesn't necessarily predict individual purchasing habits, although they're getting better and better at that, and maybe they can do that. But the distinction that Zuboff wants to make is that they can actually twist it around, invert it, and sort of compel you, in a sense, to buy that kitty litter, right? So the notion is based on the keywords or what you're, that you're searching for, or the things that you ask your friendly AI chatbot about, will give them the indication that, today, Cuz is in a really good mood. And when he's in a good mood, we can totally sucker him into joining this cause, right? And so that's when they serve you that ad to get you into that cause. So it's actually being able to position the ads, not to predict that you will do something, but to position the ads so that you will do something.
Yeah. Yeah, because, we're talking about keeping this kind of conversation at a high level to keep it understandable is really hard, because without understanding the depths and the amount of data that these companies have on us, somewhat strange to imagine that a company might be able to, in essence, force you to buy XYZ thing. But if you understand how much data is being collected and and used, you begin to see, it's very plausible that there have been purchases in recent, times in everyone's life where they've been somewhat coerced into doing or taking an action, or, purely based on an algorithmic prompt. I think it's definitely a scary time.
Yeah. I mean, I'm forced to buy coffee for some reason every single day. I don't know what it is.
But in some ways you are. In some ways you are.
Right.
You'll see, if we go through a normal day. Have you ever seen the Lego movie?
Yeah. Oh, right. Love it.
See, you've seen the Lego movie?
Everything is awesome.
Exactly, right? So, but like that, it might be a bad analogy, but the bit where he's, seeking out generic store coffee, I can't remember what it's called, but everything prompts you towards taking that action. And we live in a country where coffee shops are ubiquitous, they're around the corner. So everything prompts you towards that. And it's not like, this is not the result of a big tech company placing ads along your route to work, but this is, all right, this sells. Coffee shop here, coffee shop there. This item sells well. Everyone joins in. The cycle feeds itself. And then eventually it does become part of, a data set. This particular area of Seoul loves iced Americanos. All of Seoul likes iced Americanos. But, so like this particular part of Seoul buys more vanilla lattes. Therefore, in that particular area, we'll suggest more vanilla lattes on insert SNS platform here. The rabbit hole goes so far, and I'm sure you'll agree, like the rabbit hole goes so far with this kind of stuff. It's, as someone who used to work in technology scares the out of me.
Yeah. So, but I just want to clarify that this automation of consumption is, of course, just one part of the automation of capitalism to come, right? There we have the automation of production through roboticization and through AI, doing backroom work. Exactly. We have the automation of distribution through robot-driven trucks and container ships and what have you. So the proposal is that everything is going to be increasingly automated, and there will be little need for us to work, which could be a good thing or a bad thing.
Sounds great.
Yeah.
Chicken wings, cat memes, no work.
What was it? Give them circuses and something else, and they'll stay happy.
Jeez, let's just get on with it. Well, so the question I have, so we're talking about technology now. Technology will figure into your picture of what this next systemic cycle of accumulation will be. But you also mentioned earlier that each new cycle has social technologies, new political technologies. So what would those technologies look like? How do you expect then the world to change politically and socially?
Right. So, well, to explain this, I gotta go way back to ancient history again, right? The American ancient history, to the Genoese there. And the other piece of this story that is what I am bringing to Origi that's not inherently in Origi, and people could argue against this, but is that over time, the territorial logic of capital, right? The territorial logic of power, which is the logic in which people with an interest in territory use capital to increase their territory, and the capitalist logic of power in which people with money use territory to increase their capital, were very separate. And that early on, they were separate at the beginning, but have come together during the British period and then are again separating again. And that the procession has been from the territorial logic of power being the dominant one to the capitalist logic of power being the dominant one. So what does that look like? In the Genoese cycle, you had the Genoa, which of course itself was a city-state that had its own financial networks throughout the cities of Europe, was isolated as the capitalist logic of power was just isolated in these little urban centers, while the Spanish were focused on accumulating territory, making war, etc., etc. And that was what was driving Genoese capital accumulation. Was if the Spanish weren't going out there to find gold and to bring Christianity to the indigenous populations of the world who weren't looking for it, then the Genoese would have had nothing to do. Whereas when you get into the the Dutch phase, as I mentioned, they had a trading network in which the trading itself was really, in a sense, urban based. All of their network would be tied to what they would call factories or forts throughout the colonial world, not the developing world at that time. And those forts would actually just have some sort of treaty relationship with the territorial powers around them. So they were really just nodes in which the resources produced by local territories and territorial rulers would get aggregated and then sent to the center. So you begin to get this. They're a little bit closer, but they're still quite distinct. But what Origi argues is that under the British, these two powers sort of come together and work hand in hand, right? You have the territorial power, and the territorial logic is working directly with the capitalist logic, and British imperialism, free trade imperialism, is clearly the example of that. The East India Company being, again, the sort of perfect example in which it was literally a private joint stock company that was created to politically and militarily dominate the subcontinent in exchange for doing trade. Making money, right? They were given permission to rule the subcontinent and run their business there, right? So there's this very tight integration under the British Empire. In the American phase, I'm arguing that these are starting to separate again. And if you know the notion of neocolonialism introduced by Nkrumah and others, there's this idea that as the British Empire begins to fragment, the domination isn't directly military anymore. It is indirect through economic power. So trade relations become a tool of dominance over the developing world. So some economic consortium or mining companies or whatever have the dominant influence over many of today's developing countries that allows them to dictate policies there. And of course, in Arrighi's argument and other people's argument, this is also affected through the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, with their structural adjustment programs that force developing countries to structure their budgets and their governments in particular ways. So we begin to get a separation of the capitalists' logic of power from the territorial logic of power again, is what I believe. And so and then over the last couple of decades, right, if we're entering this new period of systemic chaos that is bringing us the birth of a new phase that I am predicting is going to be fully automated capitalism, without being able to say that that is what it'll be. And, it could be that Arrighi was right and China is going to be there in another couple of decades, right? I could see that happening as well. But I don't think it's going to happen. Because what I think is happening is that the distance between these, between the capitalist logic of power and the territorial logic of power is increasing. What we've seen, for example, over the last few decades, we have the emergence of special economic zones, all these spaces that undermine the integrity of the nation state that really was perhaps its strongest under the British Empire. So we have the emergence of special economic zones. We have growing prevalence of multi-passport holders. We have passports for sale. We have multinational corporations that are not necessarily beholden to any particular territorial power. So we were getting this undermining of the nation state as it has been handed down to us. And so one potential view of the future is that it will become cities will again. I think it's going to be cities. As an urban planner, it's kind of my bias here, but that cities will again be centers of the capitalist logic of power, and that will be used to dominate the world, and that the global economy will be dominated from a sort of decentered network of urban capitalist centers, based on contemporary technologies.
Okay, so not the breakup of nation states as we know them, but like London, for instance, will be one of those nodes again, as it is already. But like these city states, they will develop more capacity than they currently do and become more focal as we evolve towards the next cycle.
I think that will happen. Again, I don't want to say for sure.
Of course.
But yeah, but this is the suggestion, right? Even under the period of globalization, there was a lot of theorization that controls that took place at the nation state level were either scaled up to the sort of multinational or regional level that way, or scaled down. Certain powers were scaled down to more local, sub-regional or subnational units of governance. And so I do think that the shift is going to continue, and perhaps to the state where, perhaps as the Dark Enlightenment people would have it, that London becomes its own independent city-state, distinct from and politically independent of the UK in general. Or more likely than that, maybe there's a kind of overlapping of governance institutions as there was during the feudal period.
Well, it's interesting that you're deriving this from Origi, right? And from a theorist who has no connection to, dark enlightenment or neo-reactionary. As far as I know, he doesn't, right?
As far as I know.
Yeah, as far as we know. Because that sounds a lot like the name. I'm sure we've all heard about these dark enlightenment figures in Silicon Valley, these tech figures like Peter Thiel, I guess Elon Musk, too, and of course Curtis Yarvin. And Curtis Yarvin, of course, has this idea of patchwork cities. I'll pull up the quote from his writing. The basic idea of patchwork is that as the crappy governments we inherited from history are smashed, they should be replaced by a global spiderweb of tens, even hundreds of thousands of sovereign and independent mini countries, each governed by its own joint stock corporation, without regard to the residents' opinions. If residents don't like their government, they can and should move. The design is all exit, no voice. So that's a quote from Yarvin's writing, Patchwork Cities. So is that kind of what you're seeing Origi's logic is taking us to?
I don't know if it's Origi's logic or my own logic here. To be honest with you, I don't think Origi was thinking beyond the nation state. But I could be wrong about that. And this is me sort of projecting a little bit from these trends that I have observed, that the nation state is being undermined over the last couple of decades, and kind of in a sense projecting forward through this sort of Silicon Valley, crypto bro, libertarian imaginary going forward, right? And some of these ideas, I'm not a fan of Curtis Yarvin. I'm not a fan of these ideas, but I do think that there is some impetus behind and momentum behind his idea of of the patchwork. And I'm sorry, I just can't help but interject at this point, just for listener entertainment, that in the classic Silicon Valley sort of way, Curtis Yarvin got his start writing in his blog as Minch's Moldbug, right? But his more recent incarnation in the way that he's trying to communicate his ideas nowadays is through Harry Potter fan fiction. He has over 700,000 words of Harry Potter fan fiction in which he conveys his contemporary ideas.
I hear that is the logical step.
Clearly.
I've not heard that. That is... How?
I don't know. I still haven't read it. I'm going to read it soon. I think I got to take a look. But the quote that you have is from his earlier Minch's Moldbug days.
All right.
And the reason, I think there's a few reasons why we needed to keep and take these ideas seriously, right? So his basic model is that there will be corporations that will found, build, and manage their own cities. They will run those as they see fit in a kind of authoritarian sort of way in which ultimately just one figure at the top makes the decisions. Though he quite often suggests that maybe there's a CEO that is responsible to a board, but there is someone or a group of people right at the top that set all of the rules. And the notion of all exit and no voice is drawn from Mansur Olson's book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, which is an excellent one that everybody should check out at some point. But the basic notion is that it's a market notion of how people would choose where to live. If you don't like this place, you don't like our rules, you just leave and go to another place. And in my view, there are tons of ways that this can go wrong, but this podcast is not the place for that today. But this idea is, I think, influencing and being taken up by the current crypto regime, certainly in the U.S. going back, there has been a long history of charter cities and attempts to build these sort of independent cities, whether they are territorially independent or have other regulatory carve-outs that allow them to act in a more or less independent manner. There are proposals for this all over the world right now. And even the current president of the United States on his campaign trail in 2023 presented the idea of freedom cities, and which are essentially 10 new charter cities that would be built in the U.S. on federal land. And the reason that we can tie this in together is that Curtis Yarvin is more or less the premier political philosopher of Silicon Valley. I mean, I have serious issues with his ideas, but he is one of the main voices there. We know that figures like Peter Thiel, who funded him for a while and is now funding the president, and also funded J.D. Vance, who is the vice president of the United States. We know they traveled in the same circles. We know J.D. Vance has absorbed a number of these ideas from Curtis Yarvin, as has Peter Thiel, though Peter Thiel has apparently moved on since. So this political philosophy, this dark enlightenment, these prediction that we should just have these little tiny feudal states going forward is something that is, I think, to a certain extent, informing the decisions that the current president is making. And these freedom cities, right, are designed to, again, be corporate-run, independent spaces where they use, in the language of charter cities, they receive regulatory relief, which is that they are not bound by the same set of regulations that the rest of the country is. So, water, environmental concerns like water quality, health concerns, for research like human subjects, regulations, all of these should go, right? In these kind of spaces, companies should be able to experiment with garage-sized nuclear reactors until they get it right. I don't know, I mean, I've heard this argument made. We're just going to experiment a little bit. When we find out what goes wrong, we'll just improve it, and eventually we'll have nuclear reactors for everybody. But what goes wrong when a nuclear reactor goes wrong? I don't want to know. Or they want to be able to, experiment fast and loose with health implants, or neuron implants or other health treatments for longevity or what have you. So they want to reduce these regulatory frameworks and operate along their own rules, with the argument that this is going to bring technological innovation and economic growth. So the long point here is that if this practice does get implemented, my hypothesis is that these are going to become centers for the tech industries, of the contemporary tech industries, right? If you have environmentally friendly, as in no regulations for the environment, in your freedom city, then you're going to get data centers moving in. You're going to get people experimenting with these, with additional technologies in these spaces. And so the center of global tech management, innovation, and control over the global economy are going to shift into these freedom cities. And so we're going to get the ascension of the capitalist logic of power and the concentration of this logic in a network of cities around the globe.
Disney did it first. with the Reedy Creek Improvement District, right? Like, that is essentially their own governmental structure built within, the framework that already existed. They just gamed the system to essentially control their own district. So what you're kind of saying is we're going to see something similar, but much more control, much more, much less restriction, and kind of sanctioned by, in the case of these freedom cities, by the state that they reside in. Here you go. Here's this land. Do whatever you want with it.
Indeed. Yeah, I think so. And there is an open question about how these sort of spaces of exception have operated throughout the history. One thing that I've started to look at but haven't is that I think throughout the history of capitalism, there have been these exceptional spaces, right? Hong Kong was around for quite a long time. So I think there's arguably been a role for these spaces of exception throughout history, but that it's becoming more and more prevalent, and that's undermining the sort of governance and creating more unique forms of overlapping governance.
Right. Yeah, they were somewhat exceptions to the rule. They weren't supposed to be repackaged and reproduced elsewhere, maybe.
I'm sure Disney would have loved to reproduce it elsewhere.
Yeah.
But what I do think, another thing that I think about this is that it's more likely than not that these charter cities, these freedom cities, will actually become refuges for the well-off and the powerful, and that it will exclude or somehow have an exploited population of servant workers or
Well, exactly.
serfs. If they even need it, right? With
Yeah.
AI and roboticization, it may not even be necessary to have the rest of the people who will be pushed off into the territory around these cities.
Exile.
Exactly.
Yeah. The freedom of movement, make your choice. If you want to stay, you can stay. If you want to go, you can go. That's useful if you are allowed to go. And in an environment where there are no rules,
exactly.
Who says you're allowed to go?
And have the resources to go.
Have the resources to go. Yeah. Scary.
Indeed.
I hope that doesn't happen.
No, me too. But
my bold take of the
podcast. But for possible visions of this, right? Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, a little sort of teenage boy novel for what it is, and the one that inspired Mark Zuckerberg to push for virtual reality. Shows a world that's like this, as does a movie, Islands in the Net. Sorry, not a movie, another novel, Islands in the Net. It's a scary future.
So we've spoken a little bit about fully automated capitalism, and I think the idea is really interesting. But I wonder if there's a way we could talk about it in a more general terms, and kind of describe it for, how that affects the average Joe.
Sure. Well, more or less the average Joe is going to be unemployed here. I mean, the basic idea, as I was explaining, right, is that not only is production automated through roboticization and AI, so there's no need ultimately for labor to be involved, human labor to be involved. And distribution will be the same thing. It's just going to be automatically driving trucks, etc., which we already have, bringing things throughout the whole logistical system, and ultimately our consumption itself being automated and compelled, assuming that we have money to spend, right? Because if we don't have jobs, we don't have money to spend. So there's going to have to be some way to balance these out, which, maybe this is where people say UBI and things like this might come in. But we needn't necessarily go there. But one piece of it has sort of modeled consumers and sort of guided consumption, if you will, is that we as users of the internet, of the services, will effectively become serfs within the new techno-feudal organization of society.
Okay, so you mentioned two acronyms in there, and I just want to make sure everyone understands them. So UBI, could you briefly expand on that?
Sure, that's universal basic income, which is the idea that every individual is guaranteed a certain minimum income, which is basically being introduced with the idea that all production will be automated, right? So if there is no uh, as I was suggesting, right? If there's nobody working, then nobody has an income, which means nobody can actually earn money, which means nobody can actually buy stuff. So, in
Mm.
order to make sure that workers are able to buy things, then they will. The idea is to provide a basic income for everyone.
I first heard about UBI with like Andrew Yang, presidential candidate from 2 cycles ago,
Yep.
maybe. Um, it has that idea been around longer than obviously that presidential election season, or is it something new that's coming with the ascension of AI and technology in this period?
Uh, it's definitely older than that. It's not a whole lot older than that, as far as I know. I actually don't have a precise date, but I wanna put it to the early as a direct concept, I wanna put it to the early 2000s, but I think, uh, that similar ideas, were implemented in, South America, earlier than that in the '90s through, conditional cash transfers and things like this. So the idea of trying to provide people with a basic, income, uh, has been around for a little while. I mean, I guess in a sense, welfare does that to begin with, right?
Mm.
Uh,
And that's different in some, because I was just thinking the same thing. That's different in some ways, right? Like if I get a gas credit, that's just for gas, right? That's not for anything else. But this UBI might be just cash in the bank every month in the same way a wage is, and you can use it for whatever.
yep, absolutely. Yep. I mean, that's one of the things that sticks in the craw of many a conservative is that it is money that's not earmarked for any particular expenditure. So, they're worried, of course, that, poor people are going to get their UBI and they're immediately going to spend it on, drugs and porn, I guess. I don't know.
I mean,
They're
yeah,
going to be wasted cash.
yeah, exactly. Lobster and caviar. And then
Exactly.
the concept of serfs, like, so what I'm familiar with the term vaguely. What
Right.
does that describe?
Right. Well, a serf, going back to the feudal era, are individuals who are tied to a particular plot of land and are compelled uh, by force to produce on behalf of the local aristocracy or the local, prince or king or what have you. Roughly two kinds. One is they'd either have to provide a particular a set percentage of their agricultural production to the local lord, or they would have to perform a certain number of days of corvée labor on the lord's own agricultural plots or on local infrastructure or what have you. So it's either a number of work days or a percentage of what they would produce.
And that links back to what we spoke about with patchwork cities, the choice to stay, potential servitude to the tech oligarch in charge of that particular city, or just leave, because that would be easy in this system, right?
Yep. Well, and this, just thinking about it now in the discussions of how Western Europe grew at that time, one of the ways that it did grow was that individuals who didn't like their lives in the cities, um, or in the feudal lands, could actually try to escape into the hinterlands of Europe, which existed at that time, right? And if they could survive, they could set up their own new city or new, uh, lordship, basically. that would eventually become recognized by uh, whatever higher uh, whatever individual is higher in the hierarchy there, the king or what have you. Um, so in this case, it would be people leaving the freedom cities to go into the hinterlands, the chaotic hinterlands, and hoping to survive or maybe build their own freedom city.
Right. So one thing that so I think we mentioned this earlier when talking about the patchwork cities. Uh when you have a system, so like there's this idea of, you can just leave. You can go to the hinterlands, or you can go to another patchwork city if you so please. But there's the problem that you're also being ruled by an authoritarian dictator. Just because that is like the premise for these cities, is that there is some kind of dictatorial power ruling everything. And historically speaking, you should be suspicious of a dictatorial power's willingness to allow people to freely move in and out of their territory. So there's already that, you know, issue that I think to consider, to not fully trust this idea. But the second one goes back to that fully automated capitalism, or FAC, as you might want to call it. Um, but because if that's the case, right, that we're just getting UBI, and there's really no value to human labor. Obviously, um, a lot of times human labor isn't really given the value it deserves, at least monetarily. But in the case where we're completely just dependent on UBI, where our labor has no actual leverage, really, what's the point of keeping people um, in these cities in the first place? Like, what place do people have if our labor has no value, um, and if we're at the whim of these oligarch powers?
They don't call it the Dark Enlightenment for nothing. Uh, um, to answer your 2 points, the first one is these advocates of freedom cities, or the patchwork, particularly Yarvin's notion of patchwork, is that the cities themselves would be small enough and competitive enough that they wouldn't be able to have a monopoly. And so the idea is that consumer choice would force them to provide a set of services that would appeal to enough people uh, to settle and maintain their cities. So, no monopolies in his world. Um,
Oh, I guess that settles it.
yeah,
All right.
exactly. I mean, we
Okay.
don't see monopolies in the wild, so
No,
we
no,
won't
no,
see
no.
them in these
I can just lay
relations
my
between
suspicions
freedom
to
cities.
rest. Okay.
Please do. It's all
Oof.
good. This is going to be great for us.
All right. All right.
Um, so that's the first point. The second point, though, is absolutely true, right? So um, that there would be no need for those humans in the freedom cities. They would be, surplus population, as Marx might have it, that are, just human waste, basically, which is why they might get pushed out into the hinterlands to fend for themselves. Maybe they don't even get a UBI in those cases. Um, uh, I'm not saying that these freedom cities, even want to propose offering a UBI, though they will want people to consume their goods and services. Uh, but I have also probably overstated the idea that nobody will be able to work, right? I do think in reality, it's going to be a long time before we totally get rid of some sort of high-end technical administrative work, some high-end intellectual work, and it's going to be a long time before we get rid of some of the dirtiest and sort of roughest kinds of physical work too. So I think, so there's going to be some need for these populations going forward. Um, but the other piece of it, and I'm not quite sure exactly how to make the connection here, but is that the techno-feudalist notion tries to build on this same set of relations from the feudal period, right? So under the feudal period, we could say that, yes, if people don't like it, and oftentimes they didn't like it, they could just leave. But there's a mix of dependence upon the local lord, right? So they're basically, either physically forced in one way or another, they're coerced into staying within um, their lord, the manor, I guess. I don't know my feudal geography so well, but but stay enthralled to the Lord. So sometimes this could be through physical threats. Sometimes it could be through taxation that would be owed. It could also be due to other enforcements outside of the territory, against vagabondage and things like this. So the key feature is for feudalism, or one of the key features, um, is that the labor itself is unfree. Um, the other piece, or some other pieces, and I'm drawing on this from Cedric Durand's book called How Silicon Valley Unleashed Techno-Feudalism, which is a great book. Um, I strongly recommend it. Well respected among many folks, and he makes a kind of cautious argument that tries to parallel today's, or the emerging, systemic cycle of accumulation, at least as I see it. FAC, FAC, uh, with earlier forms of feudalism as opposed to capitalism, right? So he's sort of suggesting that these sort of feudal traits are reemerging in what we have going forward. And so the one key is that labor is not free. The other key is that um, uh, the work process itself is independent and individual, right? That is, that each of the serfs would have their own farming implements, and they would be responsible for farming their own land. And if they're only giving a particular percentage or a particular number of days of labor to the Lord, they could manage their own plots any way they wanted, right? There's a kind of independence there, a kind of individual hustle on the part of the serfs, but with no real uh, drive to innovation to improve things. And that's in part because the means of production and the land were actually owned by the landlords, right? Or the lords. So they didn't have control over, whether or not they could get kicked out, um, or have any particular reason to invest in improving their own lands if the Lord is going to take everything anyway. Um, so productivity is weak, right? So this is the kind of feudal setup. The big uh, for when according to Durand, when we move into capitalism, there's a kind of shift in which, of course, by definition, or not necessarily by definition, well, by definition, the means of production is owned by the capitalists, right? The capitalists own the factories, they own the machines, they own everything, and the only thing the worker has is their own labor to sell, right? So in theory, they're free to sell their labor to anyone who will buy it. Um, but of course, as Marx points out, they're not free not to sell their labor. Right? They have to sell it to somebody in order to survive. But at least on the surface, this labor is free. But it's, in fact, because the means of production is totally monopolized by the capitalists. But it's precisely this, he argues, and Marx argues, that makes capitalism so dynamic, right? Because once you separate out labor and the means of production, then as labor becomes more expensive, the capitalist has an incentive to increase efficiency and to innovate and develop new technology and try to move forward in order to um, uh, uh, reduce overall costs if they're not going to be driven out of business by somebody else. So this is that sort of inherent dynamic of capitalism that drives it forward into growth, right? Whereas under feudalism, there really isn't any growth because there's no incentive to innovate. Capitalism itself is structured in such a way that it has to innovate, and it's driven to innovate and to introduce um, new technologies. And so, so what um, Duran wants to suggest is that now, with the introduction of uh, uh, platform capitalism, as some people call it, right? The introduction of big major platforms like Meta, like Google, like um, uh, OpenAI, any of these kind of large platforms that mediate between buyers and sellers, basically. We are seeing the reintroduction of some of these feudal relations.
If this is all supposed to drive dynamism and competition, why is Google search getting worse? Like why we're like I feel like when you look at um, many products, not just in tech actually, but like airlines, for example, especially in the USA. Not going to name any names, or Google, for example, where searches just aren't delivering the best result immediately. Um, so why do we see that happening? Is there an explanation for this trend?
Well, yeah, I mean, as you know, Corey, Doctorov argues that it's the enshittification of the internet, and what you might suggest, what one might suggest, putting Doctorov and Duran together is that enshittification is driving techno-feudalism. So I don't know. I'll let one of you guys explain enshittification.
Well, as far as I understand it, it's, the platform initially is of high quality, right? Like we want to draw in new users, new customers, new subscriptions, generate that user base, and then because why am I saying we? Because they have linked
Because you are a consumer.
yeah, that's true. Because these platforms have, drawn in a significant amount of user base that isn't likely to leave. Like if you think of, Netflix, they have some, proprietary uh, films, proprietary, TV shows, proprietary IP that is just theirs. And if you want access to that, you pay their price. And they can, using the plot analogy, that's their plot, and if you want to be on their plot, you pay their price. And they can, up the price, they can make the service worse. Like the cheapest plan at the moment is one with ads. So you now need to pay not only to access a service, but you're also paying for the privilege of being advertised to. Which wasn't the case at the beginning. So that's a step towards enshittification, and where that rabbit hole goes, I dread to imagine. I mean, we saw the other day the news. They're attempting to buy Warner Brothers, one of the largest movie studios, content studios on earth.
Yes. Along these lines of enshittification, I read today as well that some of the fears circulating around Hollywood now are that Netflix wants to kill movie theater movies, and Warner Brothers is one of the last redoubts of companies that are producing for those theaters. So there's fear that Netflix is actually buying Warner Brothers in order to shut down the movie going experience, and further capture consumers and within their own platform, their own plot of feudal land.
We will all be worse off. I like the cinema. Cinema's a good fun experience.
It is.
Yeah, me too. It's a nice like view of a bunch of people and react to something and not just like in your own house.
But to go back to the whole Warner Brothers things, I think it is a way in Netflix, it is a way of thinking about, enshittification, right? That the initial stage of it enshittification, according to Dr. Off, is that we want to attract users, consumers by providing a really good quality product. You get people used to using it. You become a large enough platform that sure, a consumer can leave, but if they leave, where are they going to go? Right. And then once that platform is big enough, what he argues is that the the provider of the platform, and he's thinking more of something like Amazon or what have you, begins to provide high quality services for producers and sellers who then become used to using the platform. And again, as they get drawn in, as the quality for them improves, and during this time, the quality for the consumer is um, uh, deteriorating, then the producers pile in to the point where the producers then can't afford to opt out either. And then after that, that's when the platform begins to make it shitty for the producers too. They stop innovating is more or less the action. Once they've captured, the markets, the producers and the consumers, then they have no more incentive to improve the platform. And the incentive they have, according to Durand and others, is simply to extract rent, right? It's just like a landlord. We own the platform, we own this plot of land. You have to live here, so pay us rent, and then you can take whatever's left. And so this is the notion for him that is turning our society into a techno-feudal society, turning us into serfs. We're beginning to be trapped on this land, on the platform itself. We wind up paying rent or profit to these large firms in order to stay on the platform. And so basically, the platforms themselves are simply collecting the surplus value that's been generated and have no reason or place to invest it in anything new. And so the argument is that, again, innovation is going to slow down, and we're all just going to be trapped in this enshittified techno feudal arrangement. Dark enlightenment indeed.
Yeah, again, my trademark now. It is bleak. Um,
Before we part ways, I would suggest, though, I think there are at least some notes of optimism out there, right? I mean, we
oh,
do
good.
have in the developing world, uh, ongoing social movements that are working toward deglobalization and trying to rebuild their own local communities. I don't know that we're seeing a whole lot of that in the North as much as we are in the South, but in the North, we also see a growing number of young folks who are beginning to reject being, a serf on Instagram's platform or whoever's platform, any of these platforms. Opting for simpler tech like, the turntable and old style cameras and things like this I was reading about today. I know this idea that they've been using. Gen Z is using earlier tech stuff is been around for a little while, but I think this is optimistic, right? People are beginning to say, I. Some people are, of course, comfortable in their own little shell, protected by walls upon walls and fed on huge consumer screens, TV screens. But I think a growing number of people want to find new ways to connect. And I think that ultimately is where our hope and where our optimistic future lies.
I agree.
Yeah, well, that's been quite the conversation.
Yeah, bread and circuses are no longer enough. So it's yeah, no, I agree with you. There's some optimism out there. Go on, Eric.
Oh, okay.
Do it.
All right,
Do your
fine. I'll wrap
ending.
it up.
End this.
No, I think that's such a good place to end on, is on that optimistic note. Because the trends that we're seeing, I know us in this podcast studio are not, techno-feudalism and these kind of viciousness we're seeing in the world towards the ideas of cooperation and connection. While it's unfortunate, these things have their limits, and I'm also hopeful that people will one day again realize that human element, that connection between us, is something really valuable to seek, and something valuable within itself. So I think Cuz put it great, and just pointing out that there are these trends of people, these small little attempts to grasp a connection that we can see in the world every day, show that, as bleak and as dark as the dark enlightenment, these ideas of techno feudalism are, that's not an endpoint, right? There's always evolution, there's always growth. And while this might be the story now, there'll be more stories later. And I hope much more positive ones.
And as Origi suggests, right, he, in his own research, he's positing that China is the next hegemon, but he's not guaranteeing it. He's just saying that these are the trends that he sees and he thinks it's heading in that direction. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's heading in that direction. And in our conversation, we've identified some trends of where things seem to be heading, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are heading there or have to head there.
Okay, with that, thank you very much for joining us, Cuz, Professor Potter. It's been an absolute pleasure.
For me too.
Perhaps we'll have you back for another subject that you investigate, and we look forward to that too.